are in a bit of a growth spurt as a community. Those of you who maybe have been coming a while have really noticed that particularly during the summer, a time when we assume that things might slow down a little bit because people are away on vacation, we have snowbirds, etc. But in fact, here, things have been really just continuing to grow. And that's not a humble brag, right? We talked about the humble brag a couple weeks ago. It's not a humble brag. It's just the reality, right? It's middle of August, and we have a full parking lot, a full room. And it's something that we're really excited about. But I want to kind of, rewind a little bit just to give you a little context of what we're experiencing. Because when we relaunched this community 3 years ago, coming out of the pandemic, fall of 2022, it was kind of a new beginning for this community. And at that time, getting 25 to 35 people in this room on a Sunday morning was a huge success. And it was, this big step for us, right? But since that time, right, in that relaunch phase, we said, of course we love this community. Of course we love what we experience here. And so we want it to grow and expand just so that more people can experience what we love and what we've experienced, right? If you love something, if something has been life-giving for you, of course you want to see it, at least have the opportunity to positively affect other people. So when it comes to leadership and the staff of this community, every action that we have made, in these past 3 years, in some ways, has been a prayer, or you might say a vote for the direction we want to go. And particularly, we wanted to grow. We wanted to, experience what we're experiencing right now. But this is true for us as human beings, right? Like in many ways, the behaviors that we engage in, the actions we take, even the thoughts we have, they are votes, right? They are prayers for the kind of life that we want to live. This is true as individuals, right? Even our thoughts, our beliefs affect what happens in our life. But it's for sure true of relationships, which we talked about last week. Like in a relationship, the decisions you make determine the kind of relationship you have. It's true of communities, right? So when you think big, don't be surprised when you're being invited to expand. And if you think small, don't be surprised when things don't really change, right? But here in this community, every step of the way, every time we grew into a new phase, the rules did change. So when, we went from seeing 25 people in here on a Sunday to 50, we approached things completely differently because we had to, right? And then when we went from 50 to 70, the rules changed again. And when we went from 70 to what we're experiencing now. And at times you feel like, oh, wow, I just figured out how to handle this phase. And then you're launched into the next phase. Isn't this true of life, right? Like every time you think you know what's going on, and then boom, new phase, new season, and you have to throw out the old playbook. Speaking of that, continual change as time goes on, I turn 32 tomorrow, and thank you. I don't know, the cheers may be for different reasons, it depends on who you are. At each stage of my life, though, what I've found is that, every year there's a new joy and a new challenge, right? There's something that, maybe a way that I understand myself more and a way that I remain a mystery to myself. This is true of life, right? Every step of the way, there's something, good and maybe something challenging. Like, for example, as I turn 32 tomorrow, I can think, well, I feel grateful that I feel the most grounded I ever have, right? Maybe mentally, spiritually, that's something that I cherish. At the same time, my knees click whenever I walk. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's always a bit of a double-edged sword. There's a vulnerability, though, that comes with growth. Because whether it's a community like ours, or whether it's just our own journey as individuals, we know we're going to make mistakes. We know we're not going to be able to please everyone. And we know that even the things that are good are going to be uncomfortable because growth is messy. Growth can be painful. And so growth requires grace for ourselves, for each other. And so that is the heart behind this new series, Growing Pains. And, I've named it after this universal experience, right, that many of us have, particularly in childhood. You're growing up, right? And I don't know about everyone else, but for me, I always have this pain in my leg, and I was like, what is this pain? And my mom would say, it's growing pains, right? And so I imagine that like my bones were, breaking and pushing and all this, But the reality, come to find out, she didn't know what she was talking about, because in fact, scientists don't really know exactly what growing pains are. There's a variety of possible explanations, but there isn't one singular reason why we experience growing pains. It's not your bones breaking apart to grow your leg, right? But what we do know, what all of us have experienced, is that on some level, just through this idea of growing pains, we become acquainted pretty early on with the idea that with growth, there is some degree of discomfort, right? When we mature, when we gain wisdom, when we become more of who we really are, it always comes at a cost. There is always some form of letting go, or you might say, things always are dying while other things are being born. There is a certain degree of pain that opens our hearts, right? It wakes us up. As Carl Jung says, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And just as there is no one singular explanation for what growing pains are, there is no one singular way that we experience these spiritual growing pains of life, right? In our journeys, we experience a variety of different types of growing pains. Sometimes we experience great change. Sometimes we go through maybe emotional, spiritual, even physical experiences that through the stretching of the difficulty expand our capacity as human beings, right? We may even face moments of letting go that are catalysts for our growth. And then we look out at a world that seems right now more than ever is in pain, is experiencing great confusion, right? That there is all kinds of letting go that we all have had to do, right? Letting go of the way that we understood things, the stability that we knew and loved. And so a question that I want to ask during this series is, what if the pain that we are feeling as a collective, as a whole, as a world, what if it's also like the growing pains in our lives? What if it's indicative of a growth spurt, right? What if we're going through a big growth spurt? And perhaps this reframe of the challenge and difficulty we face in our world, perhaps it's enough to give us some hope as we move forward, as we look for a path forward together. This is my third summer in Arizona. Just that's enough to get a laugh. People are watching online, they're like, yeah, but you get it. So what I've learned by year 3 is it's pretty necessary, before the warm weather comes in, it's pretty necessary to rearrange your closet, right? Am I right? Because the clothes that serve me well in winter are useless to me for 6 or more months of the year, right? So every year there's a time to kind of put some of those, winter clothes away, rearrange your closet. I don't know if you're like me, but if I find that when I go through that process, every year there's always clothes that I find that I have outgrown, right? It's a good opportunity to get rid of some things, to donate, right? But that moment of finding a piece of clothing that maybe you had appreciated, maybe it had been something that was meaningful to you, it's always a sad moment when you realize, okay, I've outgrown this. Maybe you've outgrown it physically, maybe you've outgrown it in terms of your style. It's just not something you'd wear anymore, but there is still a nostalgia, and it can be sad to let it go, even if you're donating it and someone else is going to be able to enjoy it. But the reality is that this is how life is, that as we grow, there are things that get left behind, right? There are things in life, dynamics, beliefs, structures, communities, whatever, things that we just no longer fit into. They might be beliefs, These might be relationships, it might be communities, it might be identities, like ways that we understood ourselves. And later, as we're going to talk about further on in this series, it might even just be an overall sense of certainty in moving through the world, right? It might just be a way that we approached life, thinking that we understood what was going on here. And so, one thing that's important to remember, through the difficulty of outgrowing something, is that every time we are outgrowing something, we are also growing into something else. It's always an opportunity. But that doesn't mean that we ignore the pain, the difficulty of that outgrowth, right? Like remember when that belief didn't work for you anymore, right? You knew you outgrew this way of understanding the world. Even if you couldn't believe what you once believed, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a pain for losing how you once felt, right? The stability that you once have. Maybe you cannot believe that belief, but you long for the feeling of what it was like, right? When things were simpler. Maybe there's a relationship that you feel that you've lost. Maybe you haven't lost it all the way, but maybe there's a certain form, right? A certain way that things were that you just cannot go back to. And there is a natural grief that arises. Maybe you used to participate in a family dynamic, and you know you have outgrown it. You cannot go back there. But by outgrowing and moving beyond that system, there are members of your family, people in your life that are naturally going to experience you moving forward as a betrayal, right? There's always some level of discomfort when we outgrow. You might be wondering, how will I even know that I've outgrown something? Well, like those clothes that you find in your closet, you might find yourself busting out of some things, right? Hitting the edges. There might have been boxes that you could once fit into in life that you just cannot anymore. I'll give you an example, okay? I have this blazer, and I love this blazer so much. It was given to me by a friend, and it used to be kind of my go-to for any nice event, wedding, etc. The reality of this blazer, the unfortunate reality, and one that even to this day I'm still comprehending and coming to terms with, is that it does not fit me anymore. There's no possible way that I'm ever going to close it, for one. It's impossible. My arms are sticking out of it. And you could probably notice that I just have a general lack of mobility. This is about my arm span right now. Nonetheless, as many of us do in life, right, I have a hard time letting go. I have worn this to a couple nice events far past the time when I should have, right? So I'm meeting people, I'm like, hello, nice to, it's so great to, how do you know the bride and groom, right? I'm on the dance floor, like, I have one move, right? I just have one little move. But this is how we show up sometimes, right? Because for me, this blazer, unfortunately, I have outgrown it, and now it is restrictive. It's restricting my movements. It doesn't allow me to express myself as naturally as I would without it, right? And so unfortunately, both metaphorically right now and literally after I get home, I need to get rid of this blazer because it just does not, I can't even get it off, see? I had kind of, as we were getting ready for today's service, I had this fantasy of like, it would be cool if I could just like bust out of it, but I did not practice that. And I don't want to, I turned 32, I don't want to pull anything in my back, you know what I mean? So we'll just toss it aside. Here's the reality though. When we remain in spaces that no longer fit us, we are denying the growth that naturally wants to occur in our lives. Right? Think of a practice fairly common in the West just centuries ago, the corset, right? Where you have women who are, in order to fit in with the beauty standards of the day, being forced to literally bind their waist to restrict and alter the natural growth so that the body and the hips and the waist are just completely reshaped. Even perhaps more extreme, you have the practice of Chinese feet binding, right? And again, another example of restricting growth to the point that the bones, the muscles develop entirely differently because they are forced to. Now, the reality is, we look at this and we can now say, though it hasn't been all that long in the grand scheme of things, but we can now look at these things and say, oh, how archaic. Yet we live our lives like this. So often we fit ourselves into places that are restrictive. We don't, in fear of the growing pains, we don't move into the new stages of life. And so we restrict ourselves from the growth that is naturally coming our way. And we forget that really there are two options given to us. As Abraham Maslow, who popularized Maslow's hierarchy, he says in any given moment we have two options: to step forward into growth or to step back into safety. Friends, stepping forward can mean losing people, right? Maybe not all the way, maybe not entirely, but maybe the way that things used to be. Moving forward, stepping forward into growth can often mean losing the predictability and the consistency and the certainty of your old life. Moving forward can often mean fear, right? Living with the unknown. Right? And this is where we're at as a community, right? We know that we can't just stay the way things are, or else we are going to restrict the growth that naturally wants to happen. So we have to move forward into something new, right? And that can bring just as much fear as it brings excitement. But the thing about these two choices is that we know on some level that there is pain either way, right? We get to choose the pain in our lives to a certain degree, right? Because how many of us know that there is a pain that we experience if we refuse to grow just as much as there is a pain that we experience if we choose to grow, right? We can either stay the way things were, stay restricted, right? Things continue to tighten around us, and that's painful. Or we can grow, face the unknown, right? Face the fear of natural growth, and that can be painful. But the reality is that we don't get to avoid pain altogether, right? I wish that was the easy message that I could give you today. But the reality is we don't get to avoid pain. However, we get to choose which pain is going to be the most meaningful and worthwhile for us. So if you're out there and the pain that you've been feeling is around perhaps something in your life that once worked a certain way and it just doesn't work anymore, right? A belief, a relationship, whatever, a dynamic. Perhaps you are being invited into something more. Now you might ask, how do I get there, right? I feel stuck. I feel in between. How do I launch into that next phase? Well, for all of us, our journeys are so unique. It's going to look unique to you. But what I can tell you is that it's probably going to happen outside of the familiar, outside of the easy, outside of the safe, the certain, the comfortable, the predictable. It is most likely going to hold within it a certain element of risk. Or as Neil Donald Walsh, author of Conversations with God once said, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. Right? It doesn't really start until we have moved past the known. There is a parable of Jesus called the parable of the talents. You might be familiar with this. If not, it's a story of a wealthy person who, tells his 3 servants that he is going away. And so he gives different amounts of money to each servant. To one servant, he gives 5 talents. This was a form of currency back in the day. Way back in the day. And then to another servant, he gives 2, and to the last servant, he gives 1. So varying amounts. Then he comes home, and he asks the servants, well, what did you do with the money? The one given 5 says that he went out, and he went into the marketplace, and he turned that 5 into 10. The one given 2 says he went out, and he turned that 2 into 4. But the one who was given 1, fearful of losing what he was entrusted, simply buried in a hole in the ground, right, to keep it safe. And so he comes back and to the wealthy man, he says, well, here I have the one you gave me. And the wealthy man is upset. He is not happy with his servant. These parables are meant to be seen as poems. They're meant to be read symbolically, and we're free to interpret them and read them through a variety of lenses. So you might read this through a lens and go, this whole setup is kind of weird and messed up, and that would be totally fine. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole social justice, political, economic lens to view this. That is great. We're not getting into that today. Today, I just simply want to view it from a more metaphorical lens, a more symbolic and spiritual lens, where we might see that we are all entrusted with something in the form of life, right? We're all given different lives. We're all given different opportunities. And we can go out and take some risks with life. We can move beyond the end and the edge of our comfort zone. Or we can take what we've been given, and in fear of what could happen, we could sort of bury it in a hole in the ground and end up kind of where we started. The reality is that life holds within it an element of risk, right? There's risk if you move forward, there's risk if you step back, right? Life is not going to be pain-free, but I think what we see from this story is perhaps this simple understanding that the failure that comes with the potential, right? Like you go out and you risk, and there might be failure there, but if you don't risk, if you don't do anything, there is a failure there that is perhaps much worse, right? Because you didn't even try. If we live our lives entirely within our comfort zones, we really shouldn't be surprised when we keep getting the same results, when we don't move beyond where we currently are. When in fact, I believe that really every moment, every day, we are being invited into a bigger world, a more expansive understanding of life, a version of you that you don't necessarily even know is possible yet, and you're walking into it right now. And all of those things hold within it a certain element of risk. If we want to move beyond who we currently are, or we want to move beyond the society that we currently have, we know that on some level to get there, there needs to be risk, courage, right? Bravery. And we know that within each of those words, there is a certain degree of discomfort. Right? There is sacrifice. There is the possibility of pain. I remember the first time I moved out of the state that I was born in, I felt kind of like what we're talking about, a little bit of having outgrown something. I came from California, so I don't want to act like I outgrew California. It's a pretty big state. It wasn't like one of those things where I'm like, this town ain't big enough for me. You'll all see. It wasn't like that. It was not like that. It was just, I had never moved out of where I lived from a child, right? And so I just had felt like I was ready for new things. I had sort of spiritually outgrown the particular life I had built for myself. And so I moved to Seattle. And, for this California boy, like showing up to Seattle in the middle of January, the night I showed up, 22 degrees. I know that's not that bad for those of you from the Midwest. I know you're probably like, don't complain. For me, it was shocking, right? And I showed up, I didn't really have any money, and I didn't have that much of a plan. And the entire first year that I lived there, things felt really fragile. The whole situation felt very fragile. I had many times where I thought, what if I can't do this? What if this just doesn't work? There was that fear of the risk that I was taking. And yet something that I've carried with me, and as I look back on that in different moments in my life, I've started to think, perhaps that is also an indication that you are walking on a path, right? That you feel that way. See, I wonder that if you're not thinking at times like, is this going to work? I don't know. Can I do this, right? If you're only doing things that you know will not fail, then I wonder if you are living a life of risk. I wonder if you're living a life of bravery. If you're not feeling growing pains, then you might not be growing. I look at this community, and I'm so grateful for leadership, staff, so many people who have helped to make, decisions about where we go. And I look back and I think about these last 3 years, and I think, if every step of the way we did the thing that we knew wouldn't fail, right? If every step of the way we did the thing that was a guaranteed success, that had no risk involved, it would almost be like we were that person digging the hole in the ground, right? I don't think we would be where we are now, right? But to move forward in life or on a communal journey, there is a certain degree of risk and failure that must be embraced. And perhaps the way through is to trust that it's part of a larger process. To trust that even when the moments and the experiences that are stretching us are uncomfortable, they're also showing us what we are capable of. I look back, right, moving to Washington, and I realized that some of the hardest moments were also the most rewarding. Can you look back at times in your life where you would say that the most challenging seasons were some of the most fruitful? And I think one of the benefits, one of the amazing things about these experiences in life is that growth, that awareness is permanent. Because when you go through a hard season, right, when we experience something difficult and we make our way through and we see how it has expanded our awareness and our ability and our capacity, we get to take that with us forever, right? No matter what happens, you can always look back and say, I did that, right? I could make it through. We can't, once you see something, you can't unsee it. Once your awareness expands to a certain size, it simply does not revert back. Or as 19th century poet and physicist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. once said, a mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions. Maybe the pain that you're feeling right now, for whatever reason, is stretching you to your limits. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. It very well may be showing you who you are and who you can be. It's reshaping you. It's expanding you beyond what you previously thought possible. And then we look at our world today, the challenges we face as a society, as a collective, as a globe, and certainly it is stretching us. Every single day, we are being asked questions like, how much grief can I hold today? How much uncertainty about our future can I tolerate today? How much injustice can I witness out in the world and not want to give up and not give up on hope, right? Not lose hope. But in those moments when I feel lost, downcast, right, unsure about the future, there's something that I've been drawing on lately, and it's just this simple recognition that, think about for a second the stories that inspire us the most, whether true stories, whether fictional stories, it really doesn't matter, right? But there's stories, right? We all find deep inspiration and hope in story, in each other's stories, in the stories that we create. And is it not true that all of the stories that inspire us the most have a degree of struggle, right? Have a degree of overcoming incredible odds? I'll give you an example, right? Let's just pick a story together that many of us know, right? Like how many of us are familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy? Okay, books, movies. Now, in book form, this series is thousands of pages. In movie form, just the original trilogy alone, about 9 hours all in, okay? Right? Any of you out there has your significant other forced you to watch all 9 hours? You're like, I know it's 9 hours, Jake. Believe me, I was awake for 3 of them. 9 hours all in. If you're correct and you watch the extended editions, 10 and a half hours, right? But that's just for another time. So if it's a 9-hour story, here's the reality about Lord of the Rings. For about 7.5 of those hours, the heroes are getting their asses kicked. For about 7.5 of the hours, you're wondering, are they going to make it? How could they possibly be successful and overcome, right? And yet, when I'm over here and I'm getting my ass kicked by life or I'm facing overwhelming odds, I often think, I must be in the wrong story. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. This isn't right. But what if we're in the exact right story? And these are the growing pains. This is why I love the Hero's Journey framework by Joseph Campbell, which, if you don't know, it's basically this cycle that really every story takes. Every hero, every one of us goes through a certain pattern of experiences in life in order to become who we are and step into the fullness of our lives. And the great thing about it is that no matter what difficulty you're facing, it all kind of belongs. It all fits in. Right? No matter even the greatest moments of loss, overwhelming odds, and defeat, it's all part of the journey. You didn't take a wrong turn. You're right in the middle of your story. And that pain, that challenge is what catapults us into that next stage. Khalil Gibran, author of The Prophet, which I know the book club is reading right now, he says, pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Right? That our painful moments are all part of the story. And in fact, it's the difficulty that catapults us into higher consciousness. And so my hope is that this community, right, this space will be a place where we can allow the difficulties of life, right, and our collective trauma, our collective grief at what's going on in the world, we can allow those things to crack us open, to break the shell, and to add more awareness, more understanding. Now, I recognize that so far, it's in the title, and I really recognize we've talked about pain quite a bit today, and I just want to be really clear about something, because I think one of the things that we often kind of get wrong about spirituality, because of what many of us have been taught, whether explicitly or implicitly, many of us grew up in a religious setting that said that really you need to suffer in order to be valuable, right? You need to experience pain. That's where your worth comes from. I remember as a teenager, I was handed a book, and this disturbing book was marketed towards teenagers, and it was basically a book, growing up in evangelical Christianity, there was this book where it detailed all the stories about how people throughout the years had suffered and died for their faith. And it was like, here, take this book, and this is who you want to be, right? Like, this is like who you need to become. This is how your life is valuable. And what that kind of understanding does is it really creates martyrs, right? And in no way am I encouraging or glorifying pain throughout this series. That's not the point. The point is to recognize that there is just a certain degree of difficulty and challenge and pain that is already present in our lives, right? That is guaranteed to a certain degree. And what we can do is we can embrace it, saying it's not the problem. It's a part of growing. It's a part of this journey I'm on. And when we actually look at pain and we say that it's not a problem, the interesting thing that happens is we reduce our suffering. See, there's this understanding, it's somewhat of an Eastern notion, and it's basically the idea that there is pain and there is suffering, right? Pain happens. Pain is a feeling, pain is an experience, you get a bee sting, whatever, right? Suffering is when we internally reject that experience, right? And suffering is often worse when we say, this is not what's supposed to be happening. We magnify and multiply the pain of the experience by rejecting it, by resisting it. But the irony here is that if we can say, hey, it's okay, the pain's a part of it, it's not a problem, we actually reduce the suffering a great deal. And so my hope throughout this series is that we can reframe our stories so that we recognize that the hardest seasons might also be some of the richest. The things that scare us the most might be the very direction we need to go. And even a world that feels like it's falling apart might also be waking up. There's a great poet, Wendell Berry. He once said in one of his poems, it may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. Right? There at the edge of our comfort zones, at the edge of the known. Right? If you're feeling lost, if you're feeling confused, if you're hurting, if you're fearful today, I just want to tell you, you are not off track. You didn't miss the turn somewhere, right? You are feeling growing pains. And those growing pains are a sign that you are growing. So, as some of you saw through our newsletter, through social media, we have, I did tease that there's going to be a major announcement today. And if you've noticed, everything we've talked about so far, it very much relates to the experience that we are going through as a community, right? That we have described this life experience that we have, but it's also what's going on here, right? We are bursting at the seams. We are naturally being catapulted into a new season as a community. And what you may have noticed, looking around when it comes to parking, we don't have any more space. When it comes to this room, right, we can't just, knock out the walls and start again, right? Space might not be on our side, but time is on our side. And so what I want to announce is that on October 5th, we are going to be moving to 2 services, 9:30 and 10:45. That's an applause for yourself, really, because we have co-created this community together, and it's so beautiful to watch what's happening. But of course, I understand the reason why we're going to spend the next 7 weeks talking about growing pains is because I understand that the minute we talk about a change like this, you may be wondering, what am I going to lose? Right? What's going to change that's uncomfortable? And I understand that, and I want to take time to sit in that together rather than just say, hey, this is what's happening. And so just to remember, right, this is why we have begun this conversation. Now, I want to give you a couple of logistics about this change and this shift so that as seamlessly as possible, right, in 7 weeks' time that we can embark on this new journey together, right? And so here's just a little bit of information about what this is going to entail. First thing, there will be childcare. Our kids program is going to be available for both services. So if you're a parent out there and you're wondering, is that going to be some kind of restriction? Am I going to have to choose? No. Childcare available for both. So that's a win right there. The other thing, you might be wondering, like, are these services going to be unique? And the reality is that these services are going to be very similar, right? They're going to have the same spirit, the same energy, same message, same music, same meditation. They're just going to slightly lean in different directions because we naturally feel that they're probably going to, pick up unique crowds at each. And so we decided to kind of just slightly gear each service with a little bit of a theme. And so the first service is going to be leaning a little bit more on the contemplative side, on the reflective side. Some of you come in here and I notice that you walk into this space and you're very much in your energy and you're here to be reflective and in your own, internal contemplative spiritual experience, which regardless of your personality type, there's always a space for a contemplative and a meditative experience in life, right? But maybe you're the kind of person where every week when we say, hey, we're doing the 2-minute greeting, I hear your groans, okay? I hear them. If that's you, it's possible that the 9:30 service might be a little bit more your flavor. On the other hand, the 10:45 is for the people who, when we're locking up, you're still here talking, right? For the people that come and you thrive off the energy. You're a little more externally focused, right? And your experience of Aldea is more about that higher energy, communal, external feel. 10:45 is just going to lean slightly in that direction, right? Again, I want to be clear, it's not black and white. Now, there's also this common question of, well, how do we maintain this sense of community when essentially we're moving into 2 different gatherings? So there's going to be a window of time after the end of the first service, before the beginning of the second, roughly 10:25 to 10:45. And that is a perfect opportunity to make use of as a time for connection, as a time for community in the lobby. So what I would suggest is if you desire that and you're coming to the early service, plan to stay a little late. If you're coming to the late service, plan to come a little early. Now, here's the reality. Are there going to be hiccups along the way? Yes. Are we going to get everything right as we make this transition? No. Growth requires grace, right? Grace for ourselves, grace for each other. And I encourage you, as you reflect on this transition, just to apply everything that we're talking about, whether what we talked about today, what we're going to be talking about through the series, right? And just to have a sense of grace and understanding as we make a transition, when we know that growth is always a bit messy and has some growing pains, right? So we will make this transition and we will take those first few months and be really reflective, right? Listen to your feedback, see what's going on, see what works, see what doesn't. Take the first few months to work out some bugs, and if we need to continue to make changes, we will, right? We are open to that. It's fluid. I also ask that in these next 7 weeks until we get to October 5th, again, we're going to need some patience and some grace with each other just as we continue to fill this space even more and the parking lot. And I ask for that grace amidst the growth. But Aldea, whatever your situation is, whatever your life looks like, I encourage you just to go out this week and embrace your growing pains, whatever they may be.